Again, good morning to everyone and welcome to today's virtual Wolverine Caucus. Thank you very much for joining this virtual opportunity to hear more from University of Michigan, specifically today on Great Lakes water levels and where we go from here. My name is Rebecca DeVoe and I'm the Director of State Relations in the Office of the Vice President for Government Relations here at the university. For those of you joining as participants, this is our virtual Wolverine Caucus for 2021. The caucus has been in existence for over 20 years, providing a forum for Lansing U of M alumni, as well as legislators, lobbyists, staff, and advisors working in and around the state capitol and mid-Michigan. Traditionally, the Wolverine Caucus hosts a luncheon in Lansing, and programs feature our experts on timely, relevant public policy issues during the legislative session. Our mission is to provide diverse forums at which U of M friends can meet one another, enjoy fellowship, and exchange views, and hear from faculty and administrators. Before I introduce our panel, I'd like to run through some housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. If you do have questions for any of the panelists, please use the Q&A feature to ask your question. You do not need to digitally raise your hand. The Q&A feature will be monitored by myself. We will conduct the Q&A following the presentations. A reminder that in this webinar, attendees cannot see each other. Attendees can only see the panelist. As panelists, we cannot see you. My only recommendation for viewing this, as we have a few participants, is to put it on speaker mode because otherwise a lot of other screens show up. I think we have almost 300 people who have RSVP'd for this call. So unfortunately, we won't get to all of your questions, but we will do our best to try and answer questions through email follow-up or through our presentation. So with that said, I want to introduce our first presenter. It's Dr. Drew Gronwald, who is an associate professor with the School of Environmental and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. While also having faculty appointments in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and the Department of Earth and Environmental Science. Dr. Gronwald conducts research through a range of hydrological science projects that explore methods for quantifying and communicating uncertainties arising within long-term monitoring networks and data, and incorporating those uncertainties into models and risk-based water resource management decisions. Much of his recent research has focused on monitoring, analyzing, and forecasting the long-term water budget and water levels of the Great Lakes. Prior to his work at U of M, he was the lead hydrologist at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Great Lakes Environmental Research Laboratory. Our second presenter is John W. Allen. He recently joined the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan in the fall of 2019. His work focuses on the enterprise of sustainability across Michigan and the Great Lakes region, related to the intersection of ecological, economic, social, and cultural value. He seeks to understand and influence the rate at which the region is adapting and implementing the principles of a sustainable and just society. John was previously the director of the Michigan Office of the Great Lakes. He also served as one of the key leaders on the Great Lakes Compact negotiations, focusing on how he could bring science, environmental vision, and pragmatic solutions to policy problems. With those introductions, I will turn it over to Dr. Gronwald to begin today's conversation. Thank you, Drew.
Rebecca, thank you so much for the introduction. And thank you, John, for being here as another panelist. And thank you to the audience here for being here and taking time out of your Friday for this conversation and discussion. So to start things off, my opening remarks, I have really 4 key points that I want to make to get our thoughts moving on this and get a discussion and questions going. And the first one has to do with using the Great Lakes as a context for our research at the University of Michigan and elsewhere. And it sort of answers the question, why the Great Lakes? And I'd like to start off with making a point about the magnitude of the lakes. And there are a lot of ways that we can quantify the magnitude of the lakes, many of which you've heard about. But the most recent one that we've come up with that I find extraordinarily compelling is that there are roughly 100 million lakes across the Earth's surface. And they account for virtually all of the fresh surface water storage. So again, 100 million lakes, all of the fresh surface water storage is essentially stored in these lakes. Rivers are relatively transient, but they don't have the same capacity and volume really as lakes from a fresh surface water storage perspective. And here's the key point. For all of that fresh water in those 100 million lakes, there are 10 large lakes on Earth that hold 80% of all of that water. And several of them are right here in our backyard. So when we talk about global water balance accounting, distribution of fresh water across the landscape, the opportunity we have to understand the Great Lakes right here in our backyard and to translate that understanding all around the world to improve global water balance accounting is extraordinary. The second key point I want to make has to do with our understanding of the Great Lakes and the historical record. For those of you who are interested in water levels, you may know this, but water level gauges on the Great Lakes date back to the mid-1800s, which is also extraordinary. There are very few freshwater systems on Earth that have a long and continuous monitoring record that extends for decades, let alone over a century and a half. So our ability to understand historical water level fluctuations across the system is also extraordinary, and it sort of doubles down on that statement I made about being able to learn and translate our understanding to other systems. The third key point I want to make has to do with the types of water level variability that we experience on the Great Lakes. And it's really helpful to break that variability down into 3 different timescales. The first timescale is looking at variability across years or even decades. And those fluctuations are primarily due to long-term changes in precipitation, bringing water into the basin, and evaporation off the lake surfaces, or evapotranspiration off of the land surfaces. So the balance between precipitation of water coming in, evaporation and evapotranspiration leaving the basin leads to these long-term changes in water levels. The low water levels that we experienced on Lake Superior, Michigan, and Huron between 1998 and 2013 are a great example of this long-term change in water balance. More specifically, it was during that time period that evaporation rates across the region went through the roof, almost literally, causing water levels to go down. But similarly, the period from 2014 to present represents a period of extreme precipitation abundance. So we had 7 years of extreme precipitation, leading to 7 years of above average and rising water levels. A second time scale that it's helpful to think about is the seasonal or month-to-month time scale. I know some of you had some questions about that type of variability, but it's important to remember when we think about that seasonal water level variability that the primary forces on water levels at that scale, precipitation, evaporation, and the runoff through rivers and streams, they also have a very strong seasonal cycle. For example, the runoff that comes into the lakes from all the rivers and streams is influenced a lot by the accumulation and the melting of snow. And over time, we're seeing changes in the way that precipitation falls, either as snow and rain in the wintertime, and the rate at which it melts. So that's the second time scale. And the third time scale that's helpful to think of is the very short-term meteorological time scale, and in terms of water level variability over days or hours. And those events are usually driven by meteorological phenomena like wind events or even changes in atmospheric pressure that can cause perturbations in the lake surface and lead to coastal water level variability. So first point, why the Great Lakes. Second point, long monitoring record. Third point was types of variability. And the fourth and final sort of key overview point I would like to make here has to do with the future and our ability to forecast and predict water levels. And I want to start off by making the point that forecasting water levels is extremely challenging across the Great Lakes system, in part because they are a massive system, in part because of the vast surface area of the lakes and the impact of the surface area of the lakes on the regional climate and hydrological system. In other words, if you think about lake effect snow events and the extent to which that poses a challenge to understanding how changes in precipitation move throughout the system, that's just one example of how the lakes impact the regional water balance. But there are broader scales as well. There are large air masses that come from all over the continent, including the Gulf of Mexico, the Atlantic Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and the Arctic, that can at times bring to our region changes in temperature and changes in moisture. And there are so many different combinations of those air masses that can happen over years or decades that it is very, very hard to predict what might happen to this region over long time scales. And finally, I'll leave you with the idea that at very, very short time scales, there is an opportunity going on right now for improvements to how we understand hourly to daily changes. There have been a lot of improvements in meteorological forecasting, and there's great work being done to try to improve forecasting at those short-term timescales. So Rebecca, I will stop there regarding my opening remarks, and I'm happy to turn things over back to you and John, and look forward to answering questions later on.
Thank you, Drew. John, we'll hear from you now. Thanks.
Find my mute so I don't have to be reminded. It wouldn't be a Zoom call without somebody being reminded of that. I like Drew, have a few sort of framing comments. We want to spend as much time on questions as we can. You may be pleased to know that neither Drew nor I want to do slides with you today, because you probably are all slided out. Many of you are. But I want to start with a simple notion. And when I used to give speeches on this, haven't in the last year, but when I used to give speeches on this topic, I would tell my audiences that I'm one of the great prognosticators. I can tell you with absolute certainty that Great Lakes water levels will go up and they will go down. We know that beyond a shadow of a doubt. Unlike Drew, who wants to know when, where, and how much, I can't tell you that. But I can tell you with absolute certainty that they will go up and they will go down. We will have peaks and we will have troughs. We will have gradual movements and we will have sharp movements. What that leads us to believe and understand is that the Great Lakes, the health of the Great Lakes, live within a bandwidth of water levels. There is no such thing ecologically as a average. Average is a numerical number over time. But if the Great Lakes stood at an average expectation, they would not be a healthy system. This system is functionally important to be at high and at low and in between. There are times when that has consequences, and those consequences are principally because humans, people, put structures, infrastructure, right, roads, houses, docks, etc., in that bandwidth, partly with the expectation that there's an average, and not fully cognizant or understanding that this is what the healthy Great Lakes looks like, not this. The shoreline, broadly, not just lake levels, but the shoreline is not a thin ribbon also on a map, but the shoreline actually moves in and out. So as water levels come up and down, the lake moves out and in. And in some cases with very shallow beaches, that can be, as you've seen, right, in Saginaw Bay and in other places, that can be hundreds and hundreds of feet of shoreline exposed. And in deep systems and slow and very sharp systems, the water level does appear to come up and down, as it does in some rocky shorelines. So understanding the nature not just of the up and down movements, the prediction of water levels per se, but recognizing this to be a function of wave and beach and action, tells us that we're really talking about a broad living width of shoreline on the water side and on the land side that is a consequence. This ribbon, which is a ribbon, not a line, is a living thing. It lives relative to the fact that it moves. It moves inland, it moves waterward. It does move up and down. Our systems change. Soft soil systems erode. Sandy systems blow and move. And it's not just moving inland, it's also moving up and down the beach. Part of the health of the Great Lakes is a function of the way sediments move down the beach. They don't just come in and out. They actually drift up and down the beach. And you can see that when we put things like long breakwalls in with sand piling up on one side and starving the beach on the other side. So you can see the consequences of some of those choices we make. We are tasked eventually and ultimately with, as Drew so capably laid out, the management of 20% of the world's fresh water. That is not just inside the bathtub, the water inside the bathtub, but it's the consequence of that living shoreline also that falls within the remit of what do we have to manage. It is patently clear from almost every survey ever done that 98% of Michiganders, 98% of the Great Lakes people love the Great Lakes. Not just think about them, not just use them, but love them existentially. Here, we draw our inspiration and we draw our sense of self as a region from the Great Lakes. So understanding how to manage them and how to understanding this dynamic nature of the system is a consequence of what we have to really continue to figure out. Remember, though, that I don't have a firm number, but we think it's roughly around 80%, 85% of the Great Lakes shoreline is privately owned. And most of that shoreline is managed locally. It's locally managed through things like zoning and setbacks and ordinances at the very local township, city, county levels. There are places along the shoreline that are publicly owned, right? National parks, state parks, local parks. And there are places along the Great Lakes shoreline, critical dunes, for instance, that have regulatory overlays that allow and disallow certain behaviors. But most of the Great Lakes shoreline is managed as a consequence of local communities making local decisions about where to put things. And relative to the nature and the consequence of this wonderful, movable, dynamic system. If we start to think about the system on average, if we start to think about the system as fixed in time, then we will start to cut ourselves off from the very systems that create health and vibrancy in the thing that we say we love the most. As I said, 98% of the population generally says that they love the Great Lakes. We have yet to find the 2% that doesn't. We presume they exist because of polling, but I'm not sure who the 2% of the people that don't love the Great Lakes are. But so we do have this obligation, but the shoreline and this dynamic nature between water and land is where we transition from demonstrably public, the public interest in the Great Lakes, and the private interest in property. There's always a tension, both legally, ethically, regulatorily, about that tension and who pays for what in that zone, who gets to walk where, how do we get to do that, where do we get to play? But it is this transition between sort of public and private that happens in this living, moving edge, which makes, from a policy standpoint, both interesting and complicated. But it is still a fundamental consequence of the system that we say we love, the Great Lakes, that we have to think about the management of the Great Lakes, not just of the water itself, but of the shoreline that actually creates that. The other thing I will mention just briefly is the rate of change. And Drew has already alluded to this, that we've seen periods of time. I have two letters. When I was at the Office of the Great Lakes, I had two letters on my desk. I mentioned this earlier with my colleagues here, to remind me of this sort of conundrum that we fall in. One letter was from a group of individuals during a period of time when the Great Lakes were at the low end of this bandwidth. They're sort of right here, maybe setting some records. Didn't go very much lower, but it was right at the bottom, and it stayed there for a length of time. It was drew around 13 years. It sort of drifted around the low end of this. And I had a letter as the director of the Office of the Great Lakes asking us, the state, what were we going to do about low water levels? Docks, infrastructure. If you remember, $20 million were put forth in emergency dredging for small harbors, right, et cetera. I had another letter on my desk at a different period of time that says the water levels were too high and what were we going to do about it? What infrastructure, what systems, where were we going to put all this water? How are we going to get more out of the Great Lakes? And how are we going to revet, strengthen that shoreline to keep that shoreline from eroding under what was still within that historical bandwidth? So I want to make sure that I'm sympathetic to shoreline erosion, and I'm sympathetic to people that have to move their houses and for infrastructure and the TART trails where the trail went into the water and they have to restructure the trail system that the Northwest region of Lower Peninsula has been working so diligently to put together. There are consequences of putting structures in soft sediments. But we have to understand that the notion is also mediated by how quickly that happens. How fast do we go from low to high? What does that look like? And what kind of social consequence, cultural consequence, ecological consequence, and economic consequence does that beget? So let me stop there. That should give us a little bit of work, material to think through as we walk through some of the questions we have. One of the other hats that I do wear, I'm the U.S. co-chair of the Great Lakes Water Quality Board. We are one of the principal advisors to the International Joint Commission that has, some deep interest in water level management. This is a 1909 treaty organization to really help transboundary issues of water and water management, water quality, and in this case, water levels. So this problem has been recognized very early on. Water levels have deep consequences to the Great Lakes in all those domains I mentioned. And it is something that we continue to think about almost every day. Well, some of us think about it every day. And so let me stop there and let's see where we want to go next. Rebecca with questions.
Thank you, Drew. Thank you, John. As John mentioned, we'll move on to questions. I'm looking at our attendee list here, and it is a really diverse group, John and Drew, of individuals from municipalities, policymakers. It appears as if several of the individuals on this call are homeowners, what appears to be along the lakeshore, and then also some individuals from law within the legal community and others. So, in life, I think we all would love predictability. I think it would, frankly, it would have made the last year a lot nicer, a lot nicer to manage. But from a predictability standpoint, so for those individuals that are planning, municipalities, John, you mentioned trails, individual homeowners, is there a source of information related to the lake levels that is a good predictability? One of the questions is, how do we predict utilizing weather to predict the lake levels? I would assume that a 10-year prediction is a little difficult, but is there something that can kind of give individuals that sense of some kind of security or similar to watching the Weather Channel, some kind of predictability?
Well, let me start, Drew, and I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, but let me start in one simple place. And I opened my discussion today by saying I can predict with great certainty the water levels will go up and will go down. They will largely live within this bandwidth that we've seen over the last 100 years. So if I was a planner, a township planner, looking at zoning, or a homeowner looking at building, I wouldn't take a look at the last 10 years because it may only be here, but I would look at the last 100 years and say, this is the general ecological, hydrological consequence that we've seen play out and within this century. And then I would add a little margin of comfort on both sides of that. I would understand that I'm building in a living, dynamic system, and not think that I'm going to build a policy or a home, either way, around what I've only seen recently. We've seen many consequences of people building homes because they see the last 5 to 10 years and think that that's going to be the norm. The system tells us what the norm is. And I'm not talking about the norm of 7,000 years, which we don't even want to envision, right? That's many, many meters, tens of meters, hundreds of meters in some cases. But we think we have a pretty good bandwidth by which we can say, here's the healthy consequence of the coming and going of water. And I would look to those long, multi-decadal charts that Drew mentioned, the Great Lakes Viewer and others, as a one way to say, here's the system we're living in. Drew, how do you feel about that?
I feel very similarly. I am going to take the risk at sharing my screen, even though we've held off on slides. This particular question does call for maybe sharing a little bit of science.
Good idea.
So if folks, can you see my screen right now?
Yes.
This is one of the water level records that John had alluded to. I may take the risk of making it full screen so you can see a little bit more clearly. Did that work, Rebecca?
That works perfect.
Okay. So in concert with John's answer to that question, it's a very important one. I would agree that one of the best ways to learn about potential future variability is to look at this long historical record that we have. So what I'm showing on the screen here is the historical water level record on each of the lakes going back to 1860. If you look at the bottom axis on this plot, you can see it goes back to 1860. Now, there is one minor point here to make, which is that there is a time period over which this record is influenced by a phenomenon called isostatic rebound. It's the changing of the Earth's crust in response to loss of pressure from glaciers from the last ice age. We can talk more about that if people want to. But regardless, if we look at this record and you look specifically at Lake Michigan and Lake Huron together, underscoring the point that John made, this is a range of variability of around 2 meters. And if you want to get an idea of how water levels might vary, this is a really good place to start. Now, I also want to mention that I know many of you heard me and others say, hey, the past is no predictor of the future. However, this is one of the best starting points that we have. I want to also mention that when it comes to making forecasts along the annual 2 to 5 year timescales, it's important to remember that the continental and global scale processes that affect our water levels are things like Arctic polar vortex deformations, or things like huge fluxes of precipitation that come out of the Gulf of Mexico or out of the Atlantic Ocean. These phenomena have never been predictable at timescales around 3 to 6 months or beyond. Yet they are the phenomena that lead to some of these dramatic changes. So again, it's very hard to forecast these types of water level variations 6 months and beyond. But if you want to get an understanding of how water levels might vary, this historical record is a really good place to start.
Okay.
And because of that, and because of these, not just the up and the down, but you see a couple of periods here where the rate of change from low to high looks pretty steep, right? You've seen a quick run up or a quick run down, and whether that is the consequence or not. But I think adding margins of safety, recognizing that there could be new highs and could be new lows as we move forward in time, based on some uncertainties, I think is the way that I would start the gambit on planning.
Okay. I'm going to pivot here because interestingly enough, this conversation, quite a few of the questions and some of the research that I did, well, I call it research. It's not Drew research. It was Google research prior to this. Really is this theory that is, what do we do with quote unquote extra water? And I'm really going to pivot here, and I floated this question with John, and he may get fired up, which is what we like to hear. Here we are, Drew, you mentioned we're 20% of the fresh water in the world. We in the Great Lakes region enjoy that fresh water, but the rest of the nation is, frankly, whether you want to classify it as a desert or is running into some major water issues. And I include our partners south of us in Central America as well. So where do we go? How do we answer that question? Because I think it really is on the public's mind as far as, is this something that water is a commodity, and maybe not going that far, but when we say it's a resource, we also have to say that our citizens are resources, and frankly, they happen to be the people that we love on most days. So where do we kind of go from here on answering that question for policymakers and just for citizens as to how they wrap their head around it?
John, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure. So let me answer one piece of that question right away. And we look at the Great Lakes not as a commodity. We look at groundwater not as a commodity. We look at water flowing in streams not as a commodity. We have been incredibly careful in crafting policy solutions, most recently and most notably the Great Lakes Compact, the ban against diversions. And we built that set of restrictions on diversions, specifically on the notion of ecological integrity. We didn't build it on saying we want water here because we can do better with it. We built that model by saying water in its place has value, understanding the inherent nature ecologically as a consequence of sort of a conservation lens. So we built, and we also built Michigan's groundwater withdrawal system similarly on the basis of conservation, the avoidance of harm to water and water dependent natural resources. It doesn't say because we want to limit something we like or limit something we don't like and allow water for something we like. So we have to be very careful not to think about water. Once water crosses the commodity line, once it becomes commodified, then highest price wins, period. And it's under constitutional law, and my lawyer friends can chime in here. But once it's a commodity and the Commerce Clause controls, just like Michigan can't ban waste moving into the state because it's a commodity, it's been determined to be a part of an act of commerce. We have to be very careful not to cross that line. However, there is a question about if we have surplus, we have to start to understand what does that mean ecologically, economically, socially, and culturally. What does surplus look like? Is there a time, because of where we've built things, because of where we put things, because of the nature of this living edge that we talked about, where the consequences of too much water in the system may provide opportunities to look at ecological restoration elsewhere? I don't know what that looks like yet, but I think it's a fair question to ask. At what point do we start to think about periods of time when we have a lot? We'll define a lot at some point in time. What do we do with a lot? And are there other places in or out of the Great Lakes where water can be put and stored that actually increases the ecological value of other systems that have been degraded? Is there a question around the abilities to use water as an avenue of ecological response and conservation, not as a commodity? It's a very important distinction.
John?
So I don't have too much more to add above and beyond what John has said, except for one point, which is that Rebecca, the very nature of that question, it really in part is a research-oriented question. In other words, what are we going to do in the future in light of the limitations of the compact, in light of a binational agreement and the considerations of First Nations in periods of water abundance and periods of scarcity? And to what extent are climate change and future anthropogenic demands going to play into that narrative of water abundance? That's a research question from my perspective. And the good news is that we have a very strong partnership with the Council of Great Lakes Governors and Premiers in the region to work on answering that question. So it all sort of ties together with John's pragmatic approach and answer and the research questions that we're working on answering right now.
Most of the world is coming at water exactly as Drew said, as a question of scarcity. What do we do when we don't have enough? And I think largely we have moments and places in the Great Lakes where that question is salient. There are places, groundwater systems, where we may have overdrawn in some cases at some periods of time, and we have to think about that. But then we also have to think about both sides of that hydrograph. Again, we go back to that chart that Drew showed. We have to think about what is the consequence at the top, and if the future is not like it was over the last 100 years, as we've intimated, if there's even more than that, and the consequences are substantial, given the perspectives of all of the participants in the region, what is the value of that relative to its ecological flow and function? And I did not say price or commodity.
Right. So kind of transitioning a little bit into, there's quite a few questions about the difference in the lake fluctuation, and clearly, Drew, your chart showed this, the difference in the five Great Lakes. Is one of the questions is, what is some of the research, or is there research or an interest in the possible effects of dams kind of moving that water between the five Great Lakes, kind of manipulating it in that, from that perspective?
Sure.
It seemingly is a question that the public, I think, is asking.
Sure. So that's a valid question, John. I'll take a swing at this first here. So just first, from just a basic context perspective of the five lake systems, it's helpful to think of the Great Lakes as sort of a region of upper lakes, including Superior, Michigan, Huron, and Erie, all being sort of connected and hydraulically connected. The reason this is relevant is that after we leave Lake Erie, we go over Niagara Falls, and there's a huge drop in elevation down to Lake Ontario. Okay, Lake Ontario hydraulically is almost its own system, and the reason that's important is that since the early 1960s, Lake Ontario has been heavily regulated. There are structures that modulate the outflow and the storage of Lake Ontario that have dramatically changed its range of variability starting in the early 1960s. So one of the lakes already is highly regulated. There are also control structures on the outlet of Lake Superior, but they have a much, much, much smaller, almost a minimal or even insignificant impact on long-term water level changes. So there's just a couple points of context there for everybody. Now, the International Joint Commission over time has periodically conducted studies that look at what we would call multi-lake regulation, and specifically trying to implement control structures on the channels that connect the lakes to try to somehow achieve some balance of water levels across the lakes as there are changes in precipitation and evaporation. The take-home message from those studies, from my perspective, is that it is extraordinarily cost prohibitive to try to implement any type of solution like that across the Great Lakes, in part because just simply of the infrastructure involved, but also because of the magnitude of the forces that we're talking about here. The flows, for example, in the rivers or the channels that connect the lakes range between 2 to 10,000 cubic meters per second. Now, that may not sound like much, but those are continental scale flows. That's the same type of flow we see coming down the Mississippi River. So the idea of trying to control those in a way that balances water levels and interests across the entire system simultaneously at this point in time is effectively unachievable.
Yeah, I'm just going to go a little.
Real quick for Drew. Drew, I think we, in our previous discussions about this, can you remind me, and I think you know this off the top of your head, so I don't think I'm putting you on the spot. What if the total gallons of water in Lake Michigan, the difference between a low year and a high year, what is kind of a differential? Because I just remember you saying some ridiculous amount, and I don't even know how to quantify that. But yeah.
Rebecca, if I did say anything, it was not off the top of my head. It was something I had to look up. So I'm going to say I don't know. And someone online can probably go, oh, I can look it up right now online. But in order to answer that in a cogent way, I'd have to look it up. So I'm going to say for right now, off the top of my head, I don't actually know.
The reason I ask it is one of the questions is specifically about moving that water from Lake Michigan to Lake Superior due to the 9 inches above, and or at least that's what they kind of reference. And my thought is how many gallons of water would need to be pumped out of Lake Michigan to even have an impact? And then of course we have to then debate whether that impact is even good. So John, go on. That was
Well, so there's two perspectives. One perspective is we will continue to look for engineering solutions, as this conversation has highlighted, to deal with what is inevitably a problem of significant proportions and natural variability, largely maybe some additional induced human variability, right, with climate change. So is this a question that we should be thinking about engineering our way out of? And I think it's as much a consequence of where we start to choose to put things at this living edge, at this edge between public and private, as it is, how do we dump water out of the system? There have been some studies, as Drew said, about compensatory structures. When water levels were low, there was a strong push to add dams, essentially in the bottom of into the bottom of the St. Clair River, to build water up into the upper system. But within a couple of years, all of a sudden, we had a lot of water in the upper system. And I think about what the cost of that would have been to build additional inches up into the system when our beaches were very big and water was way out, and boat docks were high, or boat houses were high. All of a sudden, to turn around and find out that we had too much water in the system, and it just spent billions of dollars on engineering solutions for a transient event. So I think we have to be very careful to not fall into the bin of only thinking that this is an engineering solution. I think it is a question of our relationship with the Great Lakes and understanding them as a dynamic system, as we've talked about.
Okay. Yeah, so again, transitioning, not really, but from the engineering perspective that you alluded to, John, for those individuals that are, losing their homes, cottages that have been in families for hundreds of, or at least 100 years, some of the ones that I've read about, that trauma and that kind of dealing with those engineering situations. We've seen a lot of different structures going up along Lake Michigan specifically. There's lots of efforts as far as jointly with neighbors, and of course that causes some camaraderie and some not. How do we see that as a long term? Is there, one of the things I look at, just my own personal situation, where someone put in a break wall, a really deep break wall, when the water was at its highest last year at the end of the summer, and now that it's receded just a little bit, there's a lovely break wall with a giant hole on the other side of the lake, which of course, engineering perspective, you can fill that in. Ecologically, I don't know if that's the best solution, but where do you see these kind of structures going? Where are the best resources for people for those individuals researching this? Municipalities, how do they come up with the long-term approach? And then one of the questions, and that was a really long question, but I think you guys can handle it, was, are the Great Lakes experiencing net erosion? That I think falls in line with that question.
I'll take a swing at starting some of the response to this.
Yeah.
One thing I want to point out real quickly here is that the question about sort of homes along shorelines that are erodible in a way that can affect their integrity is a slice of a larger picture. And I think it's important to first broaden that picture a little bit and remind everyone that the shoreline of the lakes has areas where there's bedrock exposed, and there's areas where there's glacial deposits of sand, and there's areas where the shoreline is steep, and there's areas where it has a gradual slope. And every single one of those combinations of hard bedrock, sand, steep, shallow, can lead to a different sort of adaptability measure in terms of interacting with the shoreline. There are also small cities and large cities, growing cities and shrinking cities. There are areas where First Nations rely on the shoreline. So this idea of individual homes along a sandy shoreline is we need to view that within the context of the broader range of shoreline interactions. And I think within that framing, it's a tough question to provide an end-all solution to the idea of a home on a sandy beach that is transitory, where water levels might rise and fall. And the final point I'll make is that I want to underscore the idea of water level variability. The range of water levels we showed earlier, 2 meters, 6 feet of water level variability on annual timescales, not including storm impacts. So the story on the marine coasts, right, is all about what I call monotonic water level rise. Very, very slow, but increasing water levels. Just for perspective, over the past 100 years, the water levels around New York and the eastern coast there have been rising at a rate of around 10 inches a century. Okay. On the Great Lakes, we experience a 6-foot fluctuation every 10 years or so. So what does that mean in terms of where we might put homes and commercial infrastructure from a safe perspective? So I'll leave you with that in terms of a perspective, and I'll turn it over to John to see what he wants to add.
So there is no, as Drew said, there is no one source to go and say, if we do this, this is the answer. We have seen, so breakwater, break walls in particular, and groins, things that stick out and trap sand, have a real consequence of building sand on one side and starving the system on the other side. If sand is moving down the beach and you're capturing it to build up sand in one place, you're actually transferring risk down gradient, down the beach. And you see that, right? You see that on break walls. You see that in public harbors where one side of the harbor has a big beach and the other side is now eroding pretty heavily. So we have to be very thoughtful of not just the 100, 200, 300, whatever the width of that property is, but that break wall will have a consequence down system and will transfer that risk from you to somebody else. That is pretty well known and pretty well established. Hardened infrastructure at the toe of the slope, depending on the slope, depending on the structure, depending on the materials, sand, some of the erodible systems, for instance, we see in Ohio. You have some glacial till or glacial deposit on top of shale, and shale is very much fragmentable. And once that shale starts to go, that whole side is very much at risk. The southern shore of Lake Erie, northern shore of Ohio, is 70–80% concrete. It is essentially many miles of concrete from Toledo all the way to Ashtabula because of the nature of that system as a highly erodible system. I'm not sure most of the public in Michigan wants to see 85% of Lake Michigan cofferdammed or revetted. That doesn't mean that there aren't solutions that can be designed that have both ecological value, that can attenuate wave action, and that can stabilize some of those slopes. But to Drew's point, there is no single answer. There are resources. Coastal Zone Program has some resources about that. I know that Army Corps has some conversations and some resources. Many of those activities are permitted or at least looked at by the state and the federal government. But it has to be done in a way that doesn't translocate risk either in time to other people or down the beach to other people. In my view, and I'm just speaking on myself, it's not enough to put structures in your property if you're actually going to harm somebody else's property down the beach. I think those are things we have to be very mindful of. That saying, I am very sympathetic towards families and individuals, organizations, communities that have put things on the shoreline, and that is a source of both economic and personal hardship. We understand that. The question is, how much of that is a consequence of what the public should pay for, and how much of that is a consequence of what the individual should pay for? And that's not always as clear a question.
One of the items that really wanted to get to today is climate change and climate impact, and that's a big question for a lot of people today. Is as we the evidence, the research evidence related to climate change has been evident for decades. I think that the public is catching up in their sophistication of understanding, maybe acceptance, maybe not acceptance. We all know the gamut of that. When it comes to policy and climate change policy, are there things that the general public can one, point to, realize that one, that there is an impact on the Great Lakes water level or the Great Lakes in general, and where do we go as far as the policy world, and providing the carrots, providing the ways that we as a state need to look at this and manage it.
So let me, from my perspective, categorically say that climate is a major functional risk and driver for Great Lakes. It will and is changing ice cover. It will and is changing evaporation and loss. Ice cover is one of the dominant forces relative to the amount of water that gets, blown off the lakes during the winter. It is changing evapotranspiration. It is changing any number of systems in the hydrology. It is also changing agriculture, and agricultural use of water is changing. So there are many consequences that we see. I think part of the reason the public has, I think the polling now is 75% of the public understands that climate is a major forcing change in the world that we see, partly because the consequences of that are now in our own backyard. They are not in a remote, oceanic island community. They are not somewhere else. They're not only in the poles, but they are here in the Great Lakes. They're here on our farms. They're here on our shorelines. They're affecting flooding. They're affecting shoreline stability, and they're affecting our choices. And I think it's easier for people to understand when it's close and when we see it. And I think it's patently obvious that the consequences are happening. Michigan Farm Bureau has policies on climate change, recognizing that farmers know that this is real because it's changed fundamentally the way they're thinking about farming and water and cropping and soil management, et cetera. Where else we're seeing this show up, and it should be no surprise, is that the insurance companies, the insurance market, and the reinsurers are changing their actuarials based on risk. And climate is a real function of risk. And if you're in flood zones, risk maps change. If you're on the coast, risk maps change. If you're on rivers, risk maps change as a consequence of climate. And the other place we're seeing a lot of movement in the financial markets in particular, and I'll give you only one example, is in the bond markets. All of our local communities eventually all go to the bond markets for bonding infrastructure, water systems, roads, schools, parks. And bond ratings are being evaluated now for how the communities are responding to climate and other environmental, social, and governance ESG factors. It is fundamentally changing the way capital is moving in our system. That risk is being evaluated as to whether I want to lend money to you, meaning to a local community, and whether the community has gotten itself to the point where it fully understands the consequence of climate change. It will fully understand the consequence of climate change when it affects bond rating, the availability of capital, and the insurance and the payment rate back on that capital. So we're seeing a number of movements, not just on the biogeophysical side, but we're seeing these movements also in the capital and financial side. And it's happening at local communities.
Briefly, I want to, there are a lot of ways we could address this. That was a great answer from John. The one I want to focus on here from a climate change perspective boils it down to these changes in precipitation and evaporation and water levels. And what I want to point out here is that when we think about these big drivers of water levels in particular, precipitation coming in, evaporation leaving, here's what we're seeing and here's what we expect to continue seeing. Overall, rates of precipitation have been going up. That's consistent with what we expect with climate change, and they're likely to continue going up over the next several decades. But similarly, rates of evapotranspiration, that is water loss off the land surface, they have also been going up, and they're expected to continue going up as well. So right off the bat there, we have these two competing forces on the Great Lakes Basin that are both a consequence of climate change. Precipitation going up, bringing more water in, evapotranspiration going up, bringing water out. And as we see different studies about the future unfold, one of our colleagues and friends, Rupert, just posted a message about a soon-to-be published study looking at a particular relationship between precipitation and ET, evapotranspiration. We see different future plausible scenarios of water levels. But here's one thing that is new to that paradigm, and that is the changes in lake evaporation. Lake evaporation in a lot of these models was assumed to just continue going up and up and up. But what we're seeing is actually an extraordinary amount of variability in lake evaporation due to things like an Arctic polar vortex or an outbreak of cold Arctic air. In other words, as lake temperatures are presumed to increase over time, the evaporation rate can change very suddenly if we have a cold outbreak of Arctic air. So a larger climate change question that's being asked in the global community is global warming changing the stability of the jet stream and the cold Arctic air above us? If so, what's it going to mean for this region if every 5 to 7 years we get a blast of cold air that completely changes the evaporation cycle? These are the types of questions that are relevant to long-term water levels, and why there's no clear answer as to whether water levels, as a consequence of climate change, Rebecca, are likely to just simply go up or go down, but really point toward this idea of multi-annual variability looking to the future.
Well, and think about that from a timing. You could have a kind of a warmish, wet fall and a warmish, wet early winter where Great Lakes water levels are fairly high, but you can have a very quick, so you're not building up ice cover. And to Drew's point, if a polar vortex moves in, think about your skin. How dry does your skin get when it's very cold and very dry out, right? Moisture just gets sucked out of the system. So you can have sort of these transient events that are very profoundly substantial. They're substantial events changing fairly quickly. And I think, to Drew's point, hard to model.
So we're coming up on 11 o'clock, and technically we could go for a little longer, but wanted to just kind of touch base with the two of you on a couple things. I think, John, with your background, and Drew for the audience purposes, hails from the state of Maine, and it was the state of Michigan was lucky enough to recruit him here. You know, how do we, as a state, as a region, you know, when local governments, state governments are being presented, the state of Michigan right now is being presented with some amazing transitional opportunities related to federal dollars coming down due to COVID. There's continuing where we're seeing trends from an economics perspective that the state of Michigan is doing pretty well. We continue to have some increase in our just general income, but that increase and that disparity is expanding. From your perspective, John and Drew, curious, you know, because I think there's a lot of similarities in the socioeconomics of the state of Maine with what I would say is a lot of the lake regions in the state of Michigan. How do we ensure that as those local government policymakers are evaluating their long-term, they're really making decisions that are impacting those individuals that can afford to be on the lakes, that can afford to be on rivers, because frankly, the economics have driven it that way. How do they ensure, or what are good resources for them to say, how do I make the best decisions, economic, sociological decisions for the individuals that are probably not directly impacted where they have to move their homes, but they are impacted in a way that includes their lifestyles, includes you know, their access to Michigan's natural resources, et cetera, et cetera. So just curious if there's some thought there, or if there's some work or synergy going on in that.
Oh, yes. Let me say a couple things. Number one is local communities make local decisions about land use and zoning, and then they affect their local communities and who lives there. But they are also making choices that affect all the people of the state and all the people of the Great Lakes Basin, because we all have interest and love for the Great Lakes. So I want to make sure that when people are making those local decisions, they recognize they're making them not only on behalf of their own community, but the whole big community, the Michigan and the Great Lakes communities. It's not just a one-to-one, it's a one-to-many relationship. So thinking about it from that lens, that's number one. I think we have to take the long view when we build planning and recognize that we're making decisions. You know, many of you have walked the shoreline or been on parts of the shoreline, and I often see infrastructure sticking out of the beaches in various places that probably date back to the turn of the century or before. We make long decisions about the durability and the consequence of, you know, big blocks of wood, concrete, and rock that we place in between us and the lakes. Detroit, you know, Kresge Foundation spent and is still spending, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars now reestablishing the relationship between the people of Detroit and the community and their waterfront with parks and recreation and trails and access. So it's not just the public side that we're seeing, it's really recreating and reestablishing and reinforcing a relationship between people and their environment. Not just on the homeowner side, but all of us. Who comes, who's welcome, who's there. So this question does have some very important and interesting and critical questions about equity, access, welcoming, who's there and who wants to be there. I will also say one other quick thing is recently I heard I was on a conversation on a Nobel Prize seminar, symposium the last couple of days, and one of the panelists said that there's now $40 trillion of wealth, investment wealth, pension funds, investments, you know, everybody's wealth. $40 trillion have now aligned to decarbonized investments. So what I say to our communities and our state is $40 trillion with more coming is looking for investable places. So Michigan and the Great Lakes region has to be ready and interesting for those investments to show here. They will go somewhere. Are we readying ourselves to be the recipients of sustainable investments being run under this ESG perspective? Or are they going to pass us by? Where are firms that are now looking to deploy capital that have adjusted for the risk of climate and particular carbon, $40 trillion that have essentially said we need to decarbonize by the middle of the century? If we are not readying ourselves, we will not be the recipients of those investment dollars. And this region will continue to lose political power, as we just did in this last census. 5 more seats left the Great Lakes region to other parts of the country. So our political voice shrinks, our economic interest shrinks, our job shrinks. Or we can ready ourselves and move towards an economic transformation that puts the Great Lakes back in the place of being a place people want to come to, people want to play in, people want to build their business in, people want to raise their families in, and people want to build equitable, thoughtful, and just transitions. I know that's a lot to put on our small communities, but I beseech our communities. I urge our communities to build their sustainability thinking at the community level with these large components in mind, so they become attractive of people and place and interest and capital necessary to promote this transition. Part of that capital will be public. A lot of that capital will be private. Are we the place where that capital will come, or are we the place that capital will avoid?
And on a lighter note, I would also like to plug our football and basketball team recruitment, in that any way that we can increase our capital to help our recruitment in that area, that also would be wonderful. Drew, do you have anything to add? I think from a science perspective, it's kind of a weird question, but just thoughts from your perspective.
I think it's important to say that my primary research focuses on science, and I do the science to support policy, but I am not a policy maker, and I don't do a lot of research on policy nearly the extent I do on the physical system of the Great Lakes. So I don't have much more to add in response to the question. What I would say, though, Rebecca, is that as a researcher at a public university, I take my role to the public very, very seriously. And so as I see the questions unfolding here and I think about John's answer, I want to make sure that this group knows that I, and I'm sure John and others, are available at any time to help answer questions and provide guidance and information to the extent that it's helpful from a public service perspective.
And I know this is hard, but I would say if communities are interested in this, in sort of writing the next chapter, right? Who we were is not determinative of who we will be. I talk to communities all the time about sort of this notion of the past and the future. Thinking about what that is and how do we write sort of local plans to make sure we're responding to things like insurance markets, we're responding to access, right? That I think that's all knowable. It's complicated. It's hard to know where to start, but I think there are people and places that are willing to help in that transition, in thinking about what that looks like, based on the science, based on what we know of the system, based on the hydrology, based on this movements of shoreline. But we have, lots of individuals that are willing and able to step up and help communities in that forward-looking thinking.
Well, I think we still do have a lot of questions, and I tried to get at least pieces of those questions covered today. But with that said, I don't want to offer Drew and John's emails, but you can find them on our websites. So if there are some follow-up questions, or feel free to reach out to government relations and we can try to make those connections, not just to Drew and John, but to any other experts here at the institution. So as we're coming to an end here, I want to provide the panelists just one last opportunity to leave us with a statement that is either advice or providing us hope as we see this, as we grapple this issue, as we grapple these issues of where we put our resources in our thoughts. So I'll start with Drew.
Yeah, so my final thought here is going to reiterate something we talked about earlier, which has to do with thinking about the future and this idea of variability. John hinted at this in his opening remarks about the idea of, or the temptation to think about an average condition or an average water level, ultimately, which none of us really have ever experienced, regardless of how long you've lived on the Great Lakes. And so in parting, I think this idea of variability and the extent to which we are able to tolerate rapid changes in water levels, as well as potentially short-term sustained periods of highs, followed by short-term periods of lows. The question that I would leave everyone with is, what does that mean in terms of our coastal infrastructure and our tolerance for that? It's a tough sustainability question, and I don't have an immediate answer for it, but I think that's the way to think about things moving forward.
John?
I have three things. I see a question here that prompted me. One, we have focused a lot on local communities and local zoning, but it is an all hands on deck problem, right? It is not just a problem of local zoning and where the houses are, but the state is and needs to be fully engaged in policy and direction and funding and transitions. I think the federal government has a deep role. Rebecca, you alluded to that through funding packages and incentives and in a variety of ways. And then the private sector, I've talked about the private sector's role. So I do think this is an all hands on deck problem. And I think we are at that point where we understand that societally. It's not simple and linear and smooth, but I think we're there. I think we understand that these are choices we will be facing. The second thing is, I think we need to stay focused on sort of the ecological, hydrogeological consequences and not think about water in commodity terms. It's not a fungible commodity. We think about water in its place having value. and thinking about what the value proposition of that looks like. And my hopefulness is that we already see not even the tender shoots, but we see a tremendous amount of work across the board, local all the way through to the international and financial markets, as I've already talked about, making those choices. We are in that transition. We are in a period of time, complicated as that is. So I'm terribly hopeful that we will recast this narrative, that the Great Lakes will be an attractive place, not just a place where people come to because the places that they're leaving are spoiled. What we don't want is 1 million, 5 million, 10 million people to show up, and we're not ready for that. I don't know how many people will show up, or any, under climate scenarios, for instance. But we have to do the hard work to be ready for those transitions, and I see us doing that. I'm very hopeful, and I'm very sanguine about the future, because I think people will recognize that we're in that transition, and now is the time.
Rebecca, one final thing I do want to say. I know you've done a great job managing questions, and I know there are a lot of overflow questions. I just want to reiterate the point that I and John and our colleagues are available at any time. This is why we do this, to help answer questions. If there are questions that we didn't feel we had time to answer today, I would be more than happy to talk about them. To initiate a dialogue via email and talk outside of this program. So I just want to add to that point.
Absolutely. And I think this is the consequence of a research university. I think this is why research universities are critical in this conversation. These are not only policy questions. They're questions of science and the interpretation of science and how that drives societal change. I think our work and our interest and our passion is to help in that transition. But I think it is the role of the research university to participate in these deeper social questions. I think U of M in particular, but our colleagues also form a really important voice and a role, and the health and the ongoing viability of that, of the role of the research institution, U of M in this case particularly, I think is vital in this conversation. I think that's another place that needs to step in, lean in. I think it has, as you saw it. U of M recently built its climate resilience plan, its carbon neutrality plan. I think it's trying to do its part internally, as well as help and understand the nature of that transition, built on important research-based, science-based, informed decision-making. I think that's a critical role that we continue to play.
Thank you, John, for those words. And thank you, Drew, for serving on our panel today and taking the time, this total amount of time, to engage with our Wolverine Caucus, as well as our partners outside of the Wolverine Caucus. I also want to thank all of our participants. If you are interested in sharing this presentation or viewing it again, it will be posted to the university's public engagement page, which is www.publicengagement.umich.edu. It will also include links to any websites or references in today's presentation. So on behalf of our Vice President for Government Relations, Chris Kolb, and the University of Michigan Alumni Association, I want to thank everyone for participating today, and have a great weekend. See you all.
Bye all.